Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, weird history, author interviews, and now we are the archaeology hot spot because today we have two wonderful archaeologists here to tell us all about copies. And okay, before you click off, copies are very exciting, and you are going to fall in love with copies, and you're going to want to know everything that there is to know about historical copies. And you know that this is going to be true because we have Hannah on again today. I'm so excited. She was here to tell us all about the wonderful world of plasters and cements and concretes and things like that. And we already are a huge stan of concrete. And now we're going to be a huge stan of copies because we also have the wonderful archaeologist Pınar here with us. And their titles are like a paragraph long. So I'm just going to let them introduce themselves. So Hannah, why don't you go first? Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi again, I'm Hannah. I'm a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University, which is in Canada. And for the most part, I study ancient technology like plaster, like metallurgy, sometimes ceramics, mud brick, anything that people could take other things to make into a different object. That's what I think is really interesting. And I find copies super interesting because often, and we'll talk about this later, often copies are made of plaster, which is something that I'm very into, which is one of the reasons that I was drawn to them. And another friend of mine who also likes copies is my friend Pınar. She can introduce herself.
Perfect. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I think our love for copies and plaster and making kind of brings us together. Hannah and I also worked on a fun project, which was a little children's booklet for a museum that I used to work in. So that was also really fun. So my name is Pınar Durgun. I'm also an archaeologist, and currently I'm working as a curator and head of the department of the Ancient Western Asian Tablets and Seals in the Morgan Library and Museum, which is in New York, Midtown New York. So it's very easy to get to here. If anyone wants to visit ancient Mesopotamian seals, they're in the middle of New York. So come see them.
Yeah, and
as well.
I'm so excited about that. And just you saying this now, I realize that I use the Morgan Museum's like research in a previous episode.
Nice.
Yes. So if we, oh my gosh, in Hinduana.
Yes.
We had the episode about in Hinduana, and we used the research team, used research from the Morgan to create the episode. So this is like full circle, and I'm fangirling a little bit right now because I think I may have used a little bit of your research. So thank you so much.
No, that was not my research. That was
never mind.
That happened here 2 years ago by
perfect.
a person who used to be in this position. So I just started this position like a month ago. Yes. Yeah.
Congratulations. That's so cool.
New to me as well, but the people who worked on that exhibit, they, I think, did a really good job in explaining writing and women in ancient Mesopotamia. And this was also like the major exhibit about Hinduana. There was nothing like it that was like existing in the world before they made that exhibit. So yeah, we can talk about her as well.
Thank you, Hannah, for bringing this wonderful person here. I really appreciate that.
I have cool friends.
You do have cool friends. So the Cool Friends Archaeology Gang plus TK is going to talk about copies, ancient copies. So tell us about ancient copies.
So on the surface, copies and replicas, yes, can sound kind of boring and like, why would we be interested in this?
Yeah.
And I mentioned already that I love plaster, and often plaster becomes part of the story of copies. But Pınar and I have talked before about how in different time and different places, people have different conceptualizations of what a copy or a replica is and what is different between a copy and what is real. And so it's a bit hand wavy and a bit philosophical, but it's really interesting. You learn a lot of different ways that people think about things.
I think one funny thing is when people ask me, is this real about a copy? And I'm like, it's not, you're not imagining it. It is real.
It exists.
Copy is real. You can touch it. It is an object that exists, and someone made that object. So it is, and in most cases in archaeological museums, they are part of the collection. They are in themselves 100-year-old objects. So the realness and unrealness, I think, is like maybe not a good division even to like think about it in that way. It's like we kind of juxtapose like original versus the copy, but in some cases the copies themselves also kind of act as original. So I think that's also something that's difficult to distinguish sometimes. But maybe we can go back to kind of like the earliest copies.
The earliest copies.
The earliest copies that we know of.
Sure that this is the earliest copies, but it's a really great example. And this is something that I talked about with you when we talked about plaster. And that was, do you remember we talked about those plastered skulls?
Yes.
So as a reminder, these plastered skulls were from the Neolithic, before pottery, but the Neolithic, which we very creatively called the pre-pottery Neolithic period. So it's very, very creative era title. But essentially what was discovered by archaeologists thousands of years later was that people had buried their relatives who had died. We assume relatives, they're people in their social group who had died. And once they had been there for a bit and their body had started to return to the earth, started to decompose a bit and skeletonize, they would come back and collect the skull of the person, which sounds a bit morbid, but then what they did was take bits of lime plaster, which is again similar to plaster of Paris. That's the thing that you stick your hand in when you're making a gift for your mom when you're little.
Yeah.
And use that to mold over the skull to try to recreate the facial features of the people who once, lived in that body. They would use cells also, and sometimes paint like ochre. But that to me is a way of copying. It's perhaps not, copy paste on a computer, but it is an attempt to copy something, I think. And the wild thing is that this kind of process associating death rituals with making copies of people's faces is still something that goes on throughout history. This was really quite funny, is that yesterday I was reading through some social media and I scrolled and I saw this fact and I was like, I completely forgot about this fact and we should include this. And it's that one of the brands of CPR dummies, the face was modeled after the plaster cast copy of a young woman who drowned in the Seine in Paris. So that's a copy of somebody's face that's been made millions and millions and probably billions of times over. But Pınar has perhaps a more historically famous one that I thought was absolutely hilarious when she told me about her plaster face.
So this is not a death mask. So there are death masks and there are living masks, right? Like you can still make a copy of the face of a person while they're alive. So in the Morgan collection, there is a living mask of George Washington.
Wow!
A random, like I didn't know really
Washington's face, just copy of George Washington's face.
Yeah.
Chilling in the Morgan.
Yeah, chilling in our library. But this is also a tradition that comes from ancient like artisans and sculptors. And I were talking about the Egyptian example. So there is where the Nefertiti bust comes from, that is a sculptor's workshop. And they found there these master copies, which is something that like you create a copy and everything else is kind of based on that copy. So you have these like images of people made out of plaster who were probably later turned into stone sculptures. So we have these from Tal el Amarna in different museum collections. There are a bunch of them in the Neues Museum in Berlin, and they are like images of actual people. So they are almost like photography. They're like portraits of people. So yeah, like copying an image of a person, like plastered skulls, for example. I mean, how much is it like looking like the original person? That's kind of questionable. We never get to know that. And also kind of probably depends on the skills of the person who's recreating the facial features of the person, or if they're actually remembering that person. I mean, it's like for us, it's like, oh, like I remember my grandparents because I have photos of them. But if you don't have photos of them, how much of that person's image do you remember, and how much of that can you copy?
Yeah.
So yeah, an image of a person and how we copy it, I think, is like every culture in different time periods has done it in different ways. But
Yeah.
there seems, because it's so easily malleable, it seems
Yeah.
like one of these materials that we keep using.
And it sticks around for a long time because basically
Mm.
we talked about this and we talked about plaster. It's essentially you're making rock liquid and moldable. And then once it's dried, it turns back to rock again. So you have these really long lasting images made in essentially rock. But so there are two different ways we could proceed next with this conversation. And one of them is we can talk about there are sort of implications to using plaster, which has changed the way that people have interacted with the past in recent history. And Pınar has a really unique viewpoint on this because the museum where she used to work in Berlin was near this spectacular facility that has, for how long has it been open?
200 years. They celebrated their 200-year anniversary in 2019.
Wow.
Yeah, so this place
Functioned
was
for 200 years, yeah.
Wow.
making plaster casts for museums. And so I think a really neat story to talk about is if you're not just going to copy people, but you're going to copy art,
Yeah.
objects, why you would do that. So Pınar, you should tell everyone about this because I think it's fascinating.
Please.
Sure, yeah. So that is not the only one. Obviously, there are lots of different plaster workshops around the world. Even a lot of like churches have their own plaster workshop because the
Oh.
statues outside of churches, right? They're like exposed to all kinds of conditions, so they need to be renewed and renovated. So you can also put copies outside of buildings. But the Gipsformerei is this plaster workshop that was part of the Berlin State Museums. And there are like people whose job it is to create the best copies of museum objects, and they send it to university collections, they send it to other museums, because in some cases, some objects cannot be loaned to different places because of limitations, or maybe because the object itself is fragile and cannot travel. So then you have a copy on display and talk about that object through that copy. So yeah, they put together an exhibit a couple of years ago just to talk about this like process of making copies. Like, how do you make the copy, and how do you decide on like what the texture is going to look like? There are also different kinds of approaches. Like, do you make the copy so well that people cannot tell the difference, or do you make the copy so that we can tell what's original and what's not original and what's a copy? So they are like a research institution. They also produce the copies. You can look at their catalog, you can order copies. So yeah,
Get yourself a Nefertiti bust for several thousand euro.
I want a Nefertiti bust.
You could.
Pınar got me this itty bitty teeny tiny magnet that's of an ancient Mesopotamian water god that's made from there. So
oh my gosh, that's so cool. That reminds me of the time that in high school I lived in Germany and we went to the Louvre, and my mom like fell in love with the winged victory of Samothrace, the one with the lady with no head and no arms and the wings going behind her. And she bought, I believe it was plaster or whatever the material was. She bought a foot tall replica of it and hand carried it from France to Germany and was so excited about it.
Well, that's kind of a fun story because it directly plays into sort of the history of why we have these big plaster workshops surrounding museums and churches. Because in the early days of archaeology, so we're talking, 1800s, maybe late or early 1900s at latest, you have sort of the cowboy style of archaeology of people who are usually British or German or Italian going, European of all flavors, going to different places, places like Egypt, places like Greece and Rome, to do archaeology by essentially picking things up and taking them. Basically, British Museum.
Yeah.
But what museums would do is they would make obviously plaster casts of these objects that we have. But one fact that I learned actually from Pınar is that museums would trade these plaster casts. So like, hey, you got a Nefertiti bust? Well, we have this really cool statue of a Greek god, so let's trade casts so we can expand collections that way.
Like Pokemon.
But slightly more not as fun and also
Oh my gosh.
I mean, this is a cool thing, right? Like the museums are kind of building their collections, they're expanding their collections, but they're also kind of creating some sort of like historical canon, right? Like
Mm.
speaking from like ancient Mesopotamian perspective, like every collection that has anything Mesopotamian would want to have like the stele of the Code of Hammurabi, because like
Yeah.
you talk about Mesopotamian history if you don't talk about the Codex of Hammurabi, right? So
Mhm.
it's like creating this kind of historical canon, and then everyone is also replicating that. Like this is a high, like you're telling the public, like this is what you should know about ancient Mesopotamia. This is
Mhm.
important. And in some ways that's maybe good, like everyone is learning about these things, but in some ways it's
Mhm.
also what we're copying and what we're showing the public as this is the highlight, this is what is important. It's also creating some sort of maybe false idea of, or maybe like artificial idea of like the importance of certain objects,
Hmm.
right? Like what you're copying has an effect on what we think we know about a certain place or culture or time.
Additionally curates the already curated objects in museums. It brings objects from other places, but it curates them, and it has the implication of creating some perhaps misleading ideas of what the past looked like.
Mm.
So plaster, which many of these casts were, is white. So when they've got Greek and ancient Mesopotamian and ancient Roman materials and ancient Egyptian things as well that are plaster casts, they're replicas, and they're all white. We come up with this idea of an ancient past that was pristine and everything was white, when in reality, we can know both from looking at pieces of archaeological objects or scientific research on them that it was actually very colorful. Many of these things were painted, and it was quite garish in some cases, which I think is fabulous, because like, can you imagine some of these neoclassical buildings, especially I'm thinking about like Washington, D.C. in the US and all of these white marble buildings. It's like, no, they should be painted. They should have stripes and flowers. So, and while it's humorous, it also creates some narratives about like a sort of purity and serenity of the past, which can be manipulated for negative racist purposes. Like, for example,
Yeah.
this a big part of Hitler's ideologies, that he was like, you know what, I like this ancient Roman stuff. It's white, it's pure, it's great. And that's not where we want to go with ancient history. So
Yeah. So with that, it seems like there are both positives and negatives to these copies. And one of the things that when I initially read what we were going to talk about today is I was thinking about the counterfeit art and archaeology world, and if that kind of, does that count as copies? Do counterfeits count as copies? Do they not count as copies? What are the negative side effects of having copies? Are there negatives? I'd love to know about that, your thoughts on that.
it was pretty funny when we were chatting. We were like, we could talk a bit about fakes, but that's a whole different conversation.
Oh no.
But one thing that we can say that can lead us into talking about some other things that we think are really interesting, because we can talk about counterfeits at a later date, because that's also a really interesting conversation. But counterfeits and fakes create, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to create an object, create something that looks like it's an artifact or perhaps a sculpture, or I'm most familiar with fakes in terms of paintings, like more modern paintings. And what you're trying to do is create something that looks very, very similar to something that already exists. And I watched a documentary a couple of months ago about the sort of historic theft at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And one of the people that was in this documentary was actually a counterfeiter, not only an art thief, but they were also making fakes that sort of they would slip in. And they said, you don't want to make an exact copy of something that already exists. You want to make something that looks like it could be in the style of the artist that you're trying to slide it under the door of. But in any case, it's still an imitation. It's maybe not an exact copy or a replica, but it's along the same lines. And one thing Pınar and I were talking about is that when you make a copy like that to be a fake, you're essentially trying to create a copy that has a lot of high monetary value, which is strange, because sometimes in the conversation between what's real and what's a copy or fake, the copy is the one that's valued.
Yeah. So the value of copies is different, right? Like, in what we think is like, this is not original and it's copying the original, so it's it's fake or it's copy, so we value it less. And this is, I think, like, I don't want to blame everything on capitalism, but I think this has like connection to that. Like the value, the worth of the thing decreases the more you create of that. So like scarcity is supposed to be like, if it's scarce, it's more valuable, right? That's the idea that we have.
Years ago with NFTs, right?
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. But in some cases, for example, in Mesopotamia, when you read images, like when you multiply something, it means like there's abundance of this thing. This is like a good thing. If we don't, like, we value it differently, right? Like,
so like three like sheaves of wheat versus just one. Is that what you mean by multiply?
Yeah, it's like abundance of that thing. And I mean, when we talk about seals are really interesting because the object itself, like we as like museum curators and museum visitors, like when we go to a museum, we look at a seal and like the seal itself, right, the object itself, because it's made out of precious stones in some cases, we value that as like, oh, this is the original object. And it is, right? Like someone carved that, someone tried to like shape a rock into like an object that you can wear. And we tried this with
for just a moment. And anyone who doesn't know, a cylinder seal is a small, they're often pretty small, little cylinder made of sometimes precious gemstones that is a seal because it's got some type of carving or indentation on it. Then when you roll it across something like clay, it makes an image. And that could be used to seal up things. So
cool.
But yeah, as Hannah is saying, the cylinder seal is your signature. So if you are a person who does like trade, or you work at the temple and goods are coming in and you have to sign off things, you have a seal if you're an important enough person. I mean, this changes later on, like other people can also have seals, but normally if you need to sign contracts or if you're writing a letter and you need to sign your name, like you would have a seal and you would roll that seal onto this clay surface to kind of either authenticate this contract, like, you know, we're both signing it, or to, for example, in some cases, people would also seal, like how we use actual seals today. Like you would seal a door, or you would seal some goods that are being transported in a jar. So you'd like cover the jar's mouth and then you put a rope around and then you put a clay ball and then seal it. And then the person who receives it knows that it was not opened, right? So it is like a very economic, like transactional object.
Whoa.
Yeah, it is. They are really cool.
I love that.
But what's weird is, you know, you see if you're seeing it on video, you can see the images that are, you know, behind Pınar in her office there. But so those are impressions that are made by cylinder seals. And cylinder seals don't change. They get carved into this hard material and then they are used over and over and over again, like a copy.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, in this case, well, you have the museums who value the object itself, the seal, because maybe it's made of something nice, but like you can't really appreciate what the artistry and the carving is unless you see what the copy that it makes, unless you see the seal impression.
Yeah.
And Pınar, you told me that often seal impressions aren't displayed, like ones that are found at archaeological sites.
I mean, like if you have it, you would display it, but I feel like this goes also again back to this like history of collecting, right? It's like if it's like a little precious stone, like a gem, like people like collecting those things more than they like collecting little clay balls with some images on them, right? So that's also like how, I guess, like the origins of like what we put value on, like which kinds of objects. If you have it, great. Like sometimes, you know, people display letters or envelopes, like clay envelopes that have sealings on them. Those are interesting, and people, I think, enjoy seeing something that's in a completely different, like we know what envelopes look like, but this is in clay, so it's kind of interesting to see that as well. But yeah, so in this case, like the object itself, but the copy it creates as well, they to me have similar values, but maybe as visitors sometimes we don't really understand it in that way. And then also, like, there are curators, like I make impressions of seals, or like my people who worked before me made impressions. That cabinet there has like lots of different impressions of seals. Some of them were on display in the, you know, in exhibits, and some of them are not used anymore. And like, how do we value these things now? Like, do we treat them as original objects because the people who made them may not be here in like 50 years, right? Do we like store them in the same way? Because they're also like historical objects, but they're not made by ancient people. So these kinds of questions, right? Like, how do you create the copy? What do you do with the copy? And the reason why we don't know a lot of information about most of the like historical copies is because people didn't really care about copies. So they didn't put a note in the, like object, record saying that, oh, this copy comes from here because we wanted to have this, or we bought it for this much money, or we exchanged it with this person. They're like, museums just have copies of objects, and in most cases we don't know why, where they came from, or what purpose they served. So this is something that I'm interested in finding a little bit more about, like, what is the purpose and how did they come here? Why do we have them? Why is it in storage? Why is it on display? What else can we do with them? In some cases, some plaster workshops like the Gipsformerei in Berlin, they would put little seals to mark that this was their product. Because, it's an expensive product, right? There are artists who are like painting it, and they're like sculptors who are sculpting it.
Yeah, the little magnet you got me, Pınar, on the back of the box, it says cast by like Christopher B. or something like that.
Yeah,
Of course.
There is some sort of identity assigned to who made this little copy. And it's just, why wouldn't you? To me, this is fascinating because I love the idea of creating an object, something recognizable and interesting and valuable from this wonderful magical material called plaster. And so my immediate thought is, well, plaster is magic because it's making magic rock moldable. So how can these copies can be thought of as magic too in some ways? And we can think about the materiality of, well, what is this copy made of and why? And how does that change how we experience it? And it's fascinating. But the sort of difference between original versus copy and the value that we place on them, when talking about the cylinder seals, TK, actually, one of the first things that I thought of was, I think you did a video about it not too long ago, but in the little souvenir booklets in Japan, where you go and you take your little booklet that you have and you go to the site and you stamp at your fancy cultural historical site. And you're not collecting the stamp itself, you're collecting the copy, the impression.
Yeah. These right here. These are the stamps. That's okay. So these are called goshuins, and they're just the little stamps that they're usually carved out of jade. And the temple has had these stamps for pretty much as long as the temple has been a temple. They don't change at all. And you're so right, Hannah. You're so right. Exactly. Copies are all around us. I've got another copy, and this is a woodblock print, an ukiyo-e woodblock print, and it's an original. It's the original wood block, but on modern, like, museum quality paper, so that the colors won't fade. But this is the same block that was used 200 years ago by some, I forget the artist's name.
Things that we were talking about the other day was Japanese woodblock printing. And how that relates to copy versus original, because like people wouldn't display this piece of wood that's very inky. And this goes for any type of printmaking too. The idea is the artistry is in this thing that you've carved to make the art, but what is valued are the prints.
Exactly. And there is a old in Kyoto, I forget the name, but it is one of the oldest ukiyo-e woodblock printing stores. Not factory. The words are escaping me.
Workshop.
But workshops. Thank you. Studio workshop. And there is a very, very famous woodblock print of the transition between Edo period kimono clothing and Meiji period Western clothing with like the S bodice. And it's like these women, and you can look at their different hairstyles. There's like different hairstyles on the side, and these women are all standing in the front, and you can see the different styles of dress and the different patterns. And it's an incredibly expensive piece. They still have the wood block to make more copies. They just won't. And now that you two have been talking about, like, the value of copies and this whole capitalist idea of having more of something makes it have less value, I'm wondering if that's why they don't make more copies, is they don't want to depreciate the value of this one. So does age equal value? Does number equal value?
I mean, probably, but we can always give them the benefit of the doubt, and maybe we can guess that perhaps the original woodblock maybe isn't in a state which would be appropriate for block printing, or maybe something about the block printing might damage this original, and they want to preserve it. So we can give them the benefit of the doubt on that one, I think.
Thanks. You're right. We can. I'm upset because I really want that print.
I mean, it sounds really cool. But yeah, it's really fascinating. And I mean, we talked about sort of the monetary value of things and how at the Gips Formeri, I always pronounce it wrong.
That was
they make plaster casts of things, and you can order plaster casts and replicas of different objects. And to me, something that's like a very it's a little bit silly in my opinion, but it's also important when we talk about things like copies, ownership, and things like that. One really sort of big salient example is the idea surrounding replicas and archaeological objects is the status of the Nefertiti bust, the original, which is it in the, which museum is it in?
Neues Museum.
Yeah, so they don't let people copy it, right?
Yeah.
Yes, but the first copy that they made, they also didn't copy it by putting like mold around it. The first copy of the Nefertiti bust was made by a sculptor. The sculptor had to like measure every like millimeter of it and create something, and then copies were made from his copy, basically, because it was such a like important fragile object.
Yeah.
And it was scanned, I think, in 2000, I don't want to say a wrong date, but maybe like 8 or something, by the museum, to create maybe like a more like modern like mold of it. But then later on, I don't remember the date, but more recently, because the museum doesn't let you, no, at that time they were still letting you take photos. Well, anyways, 2 visitors kind of scanned the Nefertiti bust without the museum kind of knowing, and made it available online. So you can download this file of the Nefertiti bust and like print it in a 3D print.
3D print a Nefertiti bust.
Yeah, and like
the museum is upset about this because it circumvents what they wanted, their vision for this, and this can sort of enter into part of a conversation about repatriation. So repatriation of museum objects is usually how we talk about it, or human remains that are in museum and academic collections, is when objects or human remains are given back to the group from which they were originally taken. And usually this is done because they were taken from their original location under somewhat dubious circumstances, or perhaps just in some ways unethical. And you know, to me, copies are an obvious way to be like, right, so, all right, we make a copy of this object. We have a copy that we can show people in our museum that can complement our collections and give back the original. But that is often something that is not even an option in the eyes of some museums for different reasons. But to me, it's like, that's a perfect avenue for copies to help.
So that's how copies came to being, right? The idea was that you get to have some sort of access. Like it started as an idea of like, okay, well, this place doesn't have this statue, so we will make a copy so that this place can also have that statue, and this school or these students who want to draw this like Renaissance statue have access to it and can see it firsthand. So the like original idea of like creating these kind of modern copies was that more people have access to it, more people can see it, can use it. And same with these like 3D models, right? Like more people have access if they want to, like, I don't know, create little touchable copies for their classroom. They can do that without asking a museum all the time. So this like accessibility kind of function of copies is something that is not new, really. But again, like how we value it.
Not explored as much as it could be. And I mean, for me personally, and Pınar, you may agree with this, is that one of the most awesome things about working in archaeology or working in museums is that you get to touch the stuff.
Yeah.
You get to physically experience this. And it could just be that I'm a very tactile learner, But, being able to say, okay, this is a cuneiform tablet. It's this big. It feels like this in my hand. It puts you there. It shows you more about the object and therefore about the people who made the object and used it. And again, I wish everyone could touch things. And as silly as that sounds, but the Anatolian Museum of Civilization did this awesome exhibit where they made bright yellow 3D copies of a ton of their objects in this exhibition so that people could touch them and interact with them. And on top of just being a wonderful sensory experience, you have to imagine that there are people who, due to whatever neurodivergent developmental situation they may have with themselves, is that they may not be able to appreciate museum objects if they can't touch them. If they can't interact with them very closely. Like, I know that I get called out and in trouble at museums a lot because I'm standing too close to the paintings because I have some vision issues. But I was like, no, I want to see the curvature of the paint. So like for me, being that close is really key to how I experience some forms of artwork. And so having copies for that purpose so that people can interact with these objects in a more intimate and physical way is something I wish that museums would do more of personally.
Yeah. And as a teacher, there are so many times that I wish I could have a copy, a small copy even, of the thing that I'm talking about to engage my students more, because they would be all into learning about ancient Mesopotamia and Hammurabi's code if I had his code right here, or if I had these cylinder seals that they could take Play-Doh and plaster or whatever and make these seals for themselves. That would be super freaking cool. I would love that.
Shameless plug for Pınar with something that I helped with. Pınar edited this volume, and I have a piece in it, and I did the cover artwork that's called The Educator's Handbook for Teaching About the Ancient World. And like the vast majority of this volume are activities for teaching about the ancient world. And I think you said the cylinder seal one is one of them, yeah?
Yes. And you can make cylinder seals even if you don't have a stone or like a carving tool. What I've done with kids was you can cut, those like wax candles? They're kind of cylindrical, so you can cut them. And then with a toothpick, you can create little images on them and then roll it over Play-Doh. And there you go. You have a cylinder seal. So it's easy to make. You can make this in your classroom. Yes.
That's so cool. I'm going to link the crap out of that down below. There's going to be like arrows and everything. That is so cool. That's really fascinating. Thank you guys for making that. That is fantastic.
It was mostly her, but I did the cover art.
It's beautiful. With like cylinder seals too, I think, again, like making it, right? Because a lot of the objects that you see in museums are not things that were supposed to be just like standing on a pedestal. Like it's not something that you're supposed to just like look at and admire, except maybe like the statues and the big like sculptural pieces. Most of these objects were things that people were using, holding, touching, doing things with. So giving a copy of something also, as Hannah said, tells you a bit more about its function that you don't necessarily get by just looking at it, maybe. So I think like if the goal of a museum is that, well, we want to teach about these objects, then copies make so much sense. And also this like urge of like touching at in the Berlin, like in the Pergamon Museum, there's the big Babylonian gate, the Ishtar gate, and it has these beautiful like relief animals that are like shiny glazed bricks. And even though they're, like protections, like people want to touch them. And obviously you would want to touch them. That's like such a human urge. So our conservators there, we created this like panel of the dragon that is on the Ishtar gate, the Mushushu dragon, so people can go and touch it. And like, guess what? They made it mostly for kids so that they can something that's like tactile. But every time you go there, there's a bunch of people standing around and just like tracing the dragon and the talons and the bricks. And there are also tours for partially sighted people, for example, using this replica. So copies can do lots of cool things that still, we can protect the objects. Maybe it's fragile. We were not allowed to touch it. Like museum professionals are not allowed to touch everything. I have to wear gloves. Like I cannot touch certain objects that are falling apart. But if we have a copy, then everyone can touch it. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. So like in our there's copies that I'm really interested in. Like you two were talking about the Nefertiti bust. And another copy that I'm very interested in is the Terracotta Warriors. There was just a documentary that came out on Netflix, and I sat down and watched it like a kid that watches Saturday morning cartoons, like this far away from the TV.
This does not surprise me. Oh, this totally makes sense for you. It's on brand for TK.
It is very on brand, very TK. So I need to know more. Tell us about the Terracotta Warriors.
So I can tell you something that I recently learned, that there was a study on a randomly select group of these terracotta soldiers, and they measured the facial features and all the little details about the faces, because the question was, are these real portraits or are these like imagined people? Because they're made as like mold made, they're like mass produced, right? But they all have individual elements, characteristics of their faces, their like equipment, clothing, all of that. So there was a study that like measured the faces, and they were like, well, yeah, these seem like there is like enough variety to show that maybe they are based on real individuals. And there's like lots of like similarities, they said, with like certain like regions, and they said, well, we need more information to know like, you know, how much has changed over time, but there was enough variability to say that like, yeah, this looks like not so much mass produced. And this is not unique to this case. I mean, this is amazing that they made like this many copies and then individualized every piece of them. But for example, mold made figurines that we find in Mesopotamia, they're also like made in a mold, right? Like you press clay into a mold and then you have a figurine. But it's very hard to find two mold made figurines that look exactly the same. So clearly they were they're like quickening the process of making the figurine, but there's still enough attention to like make them individualized. So like, how much do you copy also then is like, well, is this a copy? Is this an artwork? Is this an original artwork? Where do we draw the line? And the same with Roman copies as well. Some of the Roman copies were based on ancient Greek or Hellenistic sculptures. Some of them were maybe exact copies of like bronze statues. Some of them were like, well, you take this part from this statue, this part from this statue, and copy them and put them together. It's a hybrid copy.
Chimera statue.
Right, exactly. So like, is that a copy? Is that original? Because nothing like this exists. This is a unique artwork, right? But it comes like the different parts come from different things. So how we define copies is also really difficult in different cultural contexts.
Yeah.
This reminds me of like a modern example that I can think of. So I'm a very crafty person. I do all sorts of DIY things. And the idea of making something that's essentially a copy, but like tweaking it just a little bit so it's your own, is something that's really familiar to me. Like you can use sewing patterns, and maybe you have a sewing pattern for a shirt, but you know, you cut out your pattern pieces, but you say, oh, I want the sleeves to be a little bit longer. Or actually the thing right behind me, for those watching in video, there's a quilt that's hanging up on my wall that I made. And I didn't just generate this quilt out of nowhere. This was a quilt pattern. And I, in fact, I didn't want to go through the process of ordering all the separate colors. So I bought a kit. And the kit said, okay, cut this many rectangles of this size and this many squares of this size. And it's all the same shapes, all the same colors that are in the original pattern, the original from which I made my copy, but I just put the colors in a different configuration. So is this a copy? Is it an original? I mean, I don't really care because I love it either way. But it's sort of a similar type of thing. It's like, oh, you remake a recipe that someone gave you, but you don't like cilantro, so you leave it out.
Yeah.
Things like that. But it's being applied to museum objects in some cases. Things that are in museums, things that people made in ancient times in more recent history. You know, if you think about it long enough, what is a copy? What isn't a copy?
Right? Because
I have copies of DNA from my parents.
And I was just literally like, I leaned back and I saw my shirt. This is a copy of an ukiyo-e like woodblock print. So, but it's in a different medium. So what is this a copy? Is this original? I feel like that meme, that guy with like the exploding nova.
The meme for thinking that I really like is it's like the lady's face and then transparent on top of her, all like those trigonometry equations.
Yes, the numbers.
That's one that I think of a lot. So yeah, this you can obviously see, I think, how Pınar and I can go around in circles about copies for so long, because there's just so many facets from, talking about us making copies now to learn more, to like students in ancient times copying their text in cuneiform so they can learn how to make the letters properly, and like we find evidence of people learning and apprentices in the past, and how there's like 8 different copies of the Mona Lisa by different artists that were Da Vinci students.
So cool. And that so you talking about that, Hannah, reminds me of the Enhenduana episode, because we don't have, to my knowledge, an original copy of the Exaltation of Inanna, arguably the first authored piece of literature in the whole world. And the copies that we have are probably not written by Enhenduana herself, but her text was used to teach people to write in cuneiform. And I would love to know your idea on that.
So I think this comes from our our modern understanding, and like trying to apply that on to the past, which is very tempting to do. But I think, so in Mesopotamia, how most of the literature and most of the texts survive to us is because of this practice of copying. So in scribal schools, people would copy important texts. So they would be, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. There is no one like writer who sits down and writes down this, and it's like that's the this is the copy, right? It gets like copied in different dialects, it gets copied in different libraries, different scribes are copying it because it is an important text to have. It's like, think about like, I mean, I'm in like in the office, there are like medieval manuscript people, so I don't want to say anything that I don't know about, but like think about medieval manuscripts, right? You're writing the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, you're not really producing that like text, you are copying that text, and that's how we have all these like copies of it. And same thing with ancient Mesopotamian texts. Like there is a library, there's like a literal library of King Ashurbanipal. And this library had copies of like the creation myth and the Epic of Gilgamesh, because like it was an idea that like kings would also try to preserve information about the past and preserve information through like text, through like statues and objects from the past. So there is an idea of like, this is how we preserve this information, by copying it and having a copy of that in the library. And I think we're so special as modern people, like, oh, we put things in museum and like copy them because we want to keep this information. It's like, no, everyone had that kind of feeling. Like, this is clearly an important thing. We should have this. Like, we should have more copies of this, right? So this is a tradition. That's why we don't have like one tablet signed as Enheduan, and that's like what's the most valuable thing. Just even like learning to write certain things. In some cases, like in some cultures, like the act of writing, for example, with like Arabic calligraphy, right? Like the act of it is also important. Or like the act of rolling the seal, like that is what's important. It's not really like, oh, is it the copy? Is it the image? It's like the act that I'm like signing it right now. It's like signing in front of like a notarized,
Or you mentioned, Pınar, the stamps that are used as a signature with, I don't know the exact term for the names of the characters, but the names of the characters in China, people have their signature stamp.
In Japan, like this is how I get my seal carving tools.
You know.
Let me tell you. They are
that.
The bane of my existence.
What
were you gonna say, Hannah? Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, you would know about this much more than I do, but it made me think of it because it's like, it's the act of, you have your stamp and you got to stamp your stamp as your signature. Got to make your copy, right?
You sure do. And so they're called inkan or hanko. And my husband uses one every single day, multiple times a day, because he works in an office. He can't do anything without using his stamp. That's his signature. And if he uses it, that means it's official. If you make a mistake on a document, you do a double line and you stamp over it using your hanko. There's hankos, there's different kinds of hanko. So one thing that was super annoying is when we were getting married, there's different levels of seriousness when it comes to these hanko. Yes, there's super serious hankos that you use for like when you close on a house or when you close on a loan. They're big, fat, like they're huge. They're like honestly this big, and you use them boom like that on this document. And then there are smaller hankos that you use for like when you close on a car. I don't know why house is more important than car, but it is. And then there are hankos that you use when you go to City Hall, and they're smaller because they're a little bit less important. And then there's hankos that you use when you sign in to like your timestamp at your job. There's so many different kinds of hanko. There's a huge imperial hanko that they use that only the emperor uses. And when the previous emperor dies, they smash that hanko so that, you know, it can't be used anymore. And like these in here, these are all hanko. They say something. I can't read them because it's really, 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 really old Japanese. And then myself, I have an artist hanko that has my name changed to Japanese. It's over there. Give me a second. Do you want to see it?
Yes,
I want to see it. I was going to ask you about this.
Let me, I'll be right back. Hold on. So my husband is just over there and he was like, do you want my hanko? So this is the one that he uses. This is our family name. And so this is like one that you can just get at the dollar store and just like, it's totally fine, which is really good that we have a last name that you can get at the dollar store, because
so this would be like the equivalent of, for North American listeners, going to like some place where they have keychains with your name on it. And if your name is common enough, you can get your name on the keychain. But if your name is not a very common name, you won't find it. You could get your stamp at the dollar store then, because
exactly.
Common enough.
Exactly. So, and this was a really good thing because when we went to go get married, we weren't sure which hanko that we needed. So I think we brought the case with us because his family has a case of like 5 or 6 hankos. So I think we brought it. And then turned out we only needed this one. So we didn't have this one. So we ran to the dollar store and we got this one. And then that was the one that we ended up using. And this is my artist one. So I used to practice calligraphy at one of my schools with the calligraphy teacher. And this is the hanko that he made for me. So this, I can read this one. So this kanji is heaven and this kanji is kindness. So te ya. So it was really neat. And it's like little jade situation. It's got the red ink. It's pretty.
A fancy stamp out of precious material for making copies that make things more official, just like we've been doing it.
Full circle, man. Full circle.
So what happens to family seals when the family elders are no longer there anymore?
So family seals get passed down. So I don't know what happened to my mother-in-law's family seals because they had 2 girls. So that family no longer, I mean, once, I hate to even think about it, but once my mother-in-law and my aunt are no longer here, that's it for that family name. And then my father-in-law, his seals got, when he, at some point, he got the box of seals. I'm not sure quite when, but it usually passes down through the male side, the chonan, if you will, which is the first boy. So eventually, at some point, my husband will get the box of stamps, and it'll go down the line just like that. Because in Japan, the women get taken out of their family registry and put into their husband's family registry, which is a whole situation that we had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. So your stamp had kanji to stand in for your first name in it?
Yes.
Or is it more common that they are only your family name?
It's usually only your family name or your artist name. So like the artist that created like this over here probably wouldn't use his real name and would use his artist name. Japan loved to just change names randomly on you, like when you accomplished something or when you became famous for something. Yeah, right? It makes things
PhD, they call you doctor.
true.
You do change your signature in your email when you have your PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's really interesting. A question, because we were talking earlier about scarcity and why scarcity can make something seem more valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I have little to no idea about, other than more or less what I've learned from you. And so you have, to put it one way, you have a dollar store family name. Is there any sort of prestige attached to having a name that is not a dollar store name?
Yeah. So there is definitely some prestige. Like if you hear a name, hold on, let me ask my husband really quick at this. Are there any like super amazing last names that if you hear it, like you're like, oh, arai hito ne, or something like that? Tokugawa is like up there. And
so
then,
it's not a dollar store last.
Then you're like, oh, probably like we're samurai or something like that. Katsu. Okay, got it. So like Tokugawa, Katsu, Oda, these last names definitely have more like spice attached to them because they do come from like samurai class families. So there definitely are those last names that do have a little bit of spice attached to them.
See, that to me, that's really interesting because as archaeologists, we're interested in material culture, the stuff, the bits that get left behind by people. And then we try to learn about people, their social structures, everything you can imagine about a person from the material culture left behind. So in thinking about these family stamps, thinking, okay, well, if you can't get these stamps at the dollar store, what is that? What does that say about things like social class, about finances? Of course, you can take it further back in history, and I would imagine that some families maybe have older heirloom stamps than other families because their family has been, high status enough to have these lovely jade stamps for a very long time. And
yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And it just brings us back to copies and scarcity. It's all full circle. So I appreciate both of you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. And I would love, any final messages about copies, anything that you want to leave our listeners with. Our delicious donuts are here to receive.
I think I would say before we put any kind of like biased values on when you see a copy in a museum, I think it's always good to think, why is this copy here? What does the copy do? And because like if you think about it, when you go to a natural history museum, most of the dinosaur dioramas you see, they're not original anything. Those are not all like imagined, like imaginations, and sometimes some of the bones are copies, plaster copies and things like that. And you still enjoy and you still learn something. So I think with archaeological objects too, there is a value to copies that sometimes maybe we ignore because we're chasing this like original, but sometimes that's not really the point of the object. So I would say maybe come into like face to face with copies with like kind of questioning, why do I feel weird about this copy, or why do I feel okay with this copy and not with this copy? Like the Great Wave, the wood block print, this famous Hokusai print, that is a copy. That is a copy, and like people love that copy. We have it on everything. You can buy a product with like a Great Wave on it. Product is, but we still value that as like almost like an original painting. With archaeological copies as well, there are lots of cool things about them, and we haven't even explored all of the cool things we can do with them.
Yeah, so cool. I love it. Hannah?
Pınar said a lot of good things already, but because that's so true. It's so important. Is that, well, why does this make me feel like, oh, well, that's not a real copy? But Something else that I think would be really important to think about is if this discussion about copies and creating new objects to represent ancient things for museums, if that's of interest to you, I really think that you should have a look at and sort of look into the ancient crafts of the past. And I say this broadly, like what Pınar was talking about with making seal impressions for, creating your wax candlestick steel and rolling it into clay. Because for me, the fact that I understand conceptually and scientifically all of the work that goes into making a plaster copy adds this additional layer of interest to the copy for me, But to me, that's one way that I can really connect with the past is by seeing an object and thinking, well, how was this made? And could I try making something like this myself? And that connection, because, you can look up everything on the internet. You could look up, I looked up a few years ago how to make papyrus paper because I had a papyrus plant. So it's like, you can look up anything. So look up, how was this thing made? And could I try to make it myself? And I think that adds another layer of personalization into ancient objects. And it can go for copies as well. Because, you can buy a bag of plaster at the store, add some water, mix it up, and make impressions of things. You can try and, I probably wouldn't try and make a copy of the human face unless you know what you're doing. Don't want anyone to suffocate, but it's just, there are so many things that you can make copies of, and you can think about how it was done and why it might be a process worth appreciating a little bit more, because it is an art in itself too.
Yeah, and I think if we were all a little bit more okay with copies, maybe museums would also be like, well, maybe we should return this thing because people will still come look at the copy and maybe they will want to touch the copy, and maybe that's okay.
Yeah. And
trying to own the original maybe is like, as the public, we're putting too much value on that.
And to sort of connect this to something I said earlier is that people in different times and different places have thought about copies and replicas and their values differently. And one example that it taught me a couple of years ago is that there was a sort of something happened a couple of years ago, and that I don't know the exact year of the thing with the terracotta warriors, which is something that you like, but a terracotta warrior was requested by a museum somewhere in Europe or North America. I don't remember. In Germany. And so the people who were excavating said, yes, sure, we'll send you a terracotta warrior. And they sent it. And the recipients were upset that it was a copy because it was a replica. It wasn't an original that had been dug out. But what was really interesting is that it wasn't the way that was seen by the people who had sent it. So I think, Pınar, you probably remember the details better than I do.
Yeah, I think you summarized it well. I think different cultures also value things differently, or even I think different purposes in museums. Are you actually trying to see the paintbrush of a painting? You're an artist and you're interested in that, so maybe then you do want to go see an original. But if you're someone I will never be able to travel to this place, but I still would like to see what these objects look like. You can look up an image, but it's not the same thing, right? Being in front of an object.
Copy.
Exactly, different kind of copy.
Exactly.
Photography, we didn't even talk about that, but
we would be here for 4 hours.
I know, that's another episode for you, TK.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think different people value copies and originals differently. And TK mentioned the temples, right? The temples need to be repaired over time, but the temple is the temple, even though maybe the pieces that build it are not the original, but it's still the original temple.
I'm gonna try not to make this a whole tangent.
Okay.
So in Japan, there are only 12 original castles left in all of Japan. Okay, and this was a castle country, but there are only 12 left because of war and fighting and all sorts and fire. So much fire. Just fire annihilated Japan for a really long time. So there are only 12 left, and not even temples. Okay, this guy Oda Nobunaga, who was one of the shoguns, one of the warlord dictators of Japan, just basically annihilated hundreds and hundreds of temples. So even the temples that we have now that are hundreds, thousands of years old. They're not the original temples because they were completely flattened and then built up again using the original techniques. I'm sorry, I'm heated about this. They use the original techniques, but they're not the original pieces of like wood and lacquer and paint and whatever. Yeah.
It's a religious site, so it's in that case it doesn't really matter what the site itself is built out of, right? Like it's the site that matters.
Exactly.
So I think, we can expand the meaning of what is a copy, what is an original, how do we feel about them, like whatever direction we want to expand it to.
Do you know any twins in your life? If they're identical twins, you can bother them about being copied or originals.
That's your homework. Go find a twin and pester them. Thank you so much, Pınar, Hannah. I appreciate you two so immensely. It was such an interesting conversation. I had no idea where it would lead us today, but I'm happy about the path that we took on this adventure into copies, and there's so much more to talk about. And Pınar and Hannah are definitely, if they want to, are gonna have to be some reoccurring guests, and we'll talk more about copies and counterfeits and all of that other stuff. You'll definitely be seeing Hannah more, because sneak peek, we're gonna be talking about colors that I'm very excited about. So again, thank you so much. And all of the places you can find Pınar and Hannah will be in the show notes below. Is there anything you guys would like to plug, to let people know? Anything?
I think we talked about a lot of things. So
okay,
we'll send you the links. Thanks for having us.
Fun. Thank you.
Of course. I'm so glad that you liked it. And I will see you in the outro. Bye. Okay. Stop recording. Whoa, that was so fun.